My
Yes, I
microphone
can
loud
hear
enough?
you. Yeah,
You can hear me? Okay.
okay. I can hear you.
All right.
Everybody good?
Yes, I can hear.
Oh, good.
All right. So we are on the number of the beast. Um, and just to refresh our memory, we are, let me make this bigger. Hold on. All right. So Revelation 13, this is the second half of Revelation 13. And it says, Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performed great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people, and by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword yet lived, and it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and it might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all, both great and small, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is the name of the beast, or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. And so, if we look back up to the part, with the image, and if we think about what we've studied about this possibly being tied to transhumanism or genetic manipulation, it's interesting that it says that the beast, that it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, and I'm guessing that idea, I haven't really studied it, but I'm guessing that the idea of the breath here is mimicking the breath of life that is also talked about in Genesis chapter 1, when God creates humans. When he creates the humans and the animals, it says that he gives them, the breath of life. And so I think this is a mockery, or a reversal of that, in terms of the image of the beast, which is possibly, tied to transhumanism. And then it says that it makes everyone, that they have to be marked on the right hand of the forehead, and that mark is tied to the name of the beast. And the name, I think, is, referencing, I think, a covenant that the people who dwell on the earth make with the beast or the Antichrist. And then it connects that idea of buying and selling, that's also tied to the number of the name of the beast. And here John says that it's the number of a man, and then he tells us what the number is. It's 666. And so there we, kind of come to our conclusion of the signifiers, or we're coming to the conclusion of it. These signifiers are these identifying markers of the beast. And I think, to put it in simpler terms, I think the image of the beast is referring to possibly, transhumanism, or something to do with our DNA, genetic manipulation, possibly, because I think what's happening here is that there's an undue an undoing or a reversal of what it means to be human. That's why we spent, a couple of weeks on trying to, I think that's a really important question going forward, is what does it mean to be human? Because if we can really understand that, I think we have a better chance of not being deceived by the beast in the end. And so I think the image is tied to our humanity as humans, and I think transhumanism plays a part in it. I don't know how much, but I would say moving forward that it's just something to keep an eye on. And then the mark or the name of the beast, like we mentioned, and I don't think it's a physical mark. I don't think we're going to be able to see people that have a mark on their hand or their forehead and say, you know what, those people, they worship the beast, they follow the beast. I think the mark of the beast is referencing basically a covenant that people make with the beast or the antichrist. And then the mark is their actions, and their actions will show where their allegiance is. And so I think to break it, to put it in its simplest terms, the mark of the beast is a covenant. And now we move to the number of the beast. What is, we know what the number is, but what is its significance? John tells us this calls for wisdom. Let he who has understanding, he says, calculate the number of the beast. And is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So we know what the number is, but how do we interpret it? How do we calculate it, as John says, or how, that's how the ESV translates it. I think other translations have count. Count the number of the beast. So how do we calculate it? I think the most popular interpretation of that is through the use of gematria. People have done it recently. The early church fathers even used gematria to try and calculate who the Antichrist might be, because they were expecting him in their time as well. And so I took this from, I can't remember what website it is. I meant to put it at the bottom, I forgot, but it says gematria is a Jewish form of numerology in which the letters of the Hebrew alphabet are substituted with corresponding numbers, and then each letter is given a value. And I put a little visual or a chart here, but there's an example at the bottom. The gematria for the word love. In Hebrew, it's 4 letters long. And because each letter corresponds to a certain number, you can calculate the number of that word. In this instance, the word love here in Hebrew equals 13. Because if you add up the letters with the corresponding numerical value that that letter is assigned to, you get a number. And so naturally, people think that that's how we're going to figure out who the Antichrist is that we just have to see what his name is, and then we calculate it, and it should come up to 666. This is from an article that we're going to be referencing a lot here in this particular study. I touched on it. If you remember I don't know when it was, last fall, maybe November, we did a great big study on Solomon and his connection to the number 666. And so this study is it's similar to that, but it's not going to be as thorough as that one was. I'll just touch on a few things here and there. But in this article, it says that most interpreters go on to agree that 666 is best interpreted as the numerical equivalent for this individual that the Antichrist or the beast, his name, with the most popular candidate for the job being Nero. And so back in the time of the early church, they were doing this. They were using gematria with different people's names, and Nero comes up to 666. But in Greek, it does. And it's not the name Nero that equals 666. It has to be specifically Nero Caesar. So if you put Nero Caesar in Greek, that equals 666. In Hebrew, you have to change a couple words or a couple letters around, and then you can get 666. So it's like, what language are we using for this gematria? And more recently, that you could throw different. There's these things on the internet where you type in words, phrases, names, and it gives you the gematria for that name. And back in the 80s, some people thought Ronald Reagan was the Antichrist because his name was Ronald. I don't know what his middle name was, Ronald something Reagan, and each of the names had 6 letters in it. And so they thought, oh, maybe Ronald Reagan is the Antichrist. And there's another guy on YouTube. He put in a bunch of different names. He said that one name that popped up was Prince Charles. Was his name comes up to 666, and then he saw that there was a statue. I showed it in the image of the beast study that we did, that there's a statue of Prince Charles. I think it's like in Argentina or somewhere in South America. He has these wings and he's like standing on a globe or holding a globe up or something. And so the guy said that, well, that's the image of the beast. And if you type, but his name, it isn't Prince Charles or Charles something. It's Charles, Prince of Wales. That comes up to 666. And so you could throw all kinds of things in there. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is I don't know if that's necessarily reliable, because there's so many ways that you could go with it. And I don't find it really reliable. And I don't think it fits the wisdom part that John talks about in Revelation, that it calls for wisdom. Just typing a name into a computer program and it showing you this, that doesn't take wisdom. It doesn't take discernment. It doesn't necessarily take skill. It's just something you put it into a program and it spits it out for you. So I don't think it really, there's not much wisdom involved in that, I would say. An early church father, Irenaeus, in his book Against Heresies, he offered up some, what he thought could be the Antichrist based off of 666. One of them is Titan in Greek, which would be, Titan in English, which refers to, in Greek mythology, the Titans, which are the equivalent to the Watchers or the fallen sons of God that we find in the Bible and in the book of Enoch. The Titans would be the Greek equivalent to those guys. Dr. Heiser, in his book Reversing Hermon, he kind of tracks on this idea a little bit, this idea of Titans. He says in Second Temple, another Second Temple Jewish connection between the Antichrist, the giants, and the Watcher transgressions is the way the Septuagint, in certain instances, renders the Hebrew term Rephaim. It uses the word Rephaim. Actually, it uses the word Titans or giants when it's translating the word Rephaim. And the Rephaim, we know, are the descendants of the Nephilim. And so there, Irenaeus was kind of tracking on this idea. And I think Dr. Heiser kind of, thinks there might be something there. And it's possible. I think there is. And he's obviously using some Old Testament theology in order to understand it. But I want to offer a different perspective on it. Maybe the one with the Titans, maybe that's a piece of the puzzle. Maybe what we're going to talk about here today is another piece of the puzzle. I'm not saying it's either or. I'm saying it could be both. They might be connected. We might just have to wait and see. So again, we got to understand that Revelation is heavily rooted in the Old Testament. And so understanding, the Old Testament is going to be key for us to figuring out what John's talking about in Revelation. And so like we did with the image of the beast, the mark of the beast, do we find this language? Do we find these terms? More specifically, do we find the number 666 elsewhere in the Bible, or specifically the Old Testament? And what do you know? We do. It's referenced 2 other times in the Bible. Once in reference to the amount of gold that King Solomon received yearly. We read about that in 1 Kings, that should be 11:14. 1 Kings 11:14 and 2 Chronicles chapter 9. And then we see the term 666 referenced again in reference to the number of the sons of Adonikim, Adonikim. And that was when some of the Jews made the trek back to Jerusalem and tried to rebuild the temple. It listed all the people that went and all their sons. And there was this guy named Adonikim, and it said the number of his sons was 666. Now, if there's a connection there with what's in Revelation, I don't know. There could be. I haven't studied it too much. What I'm more like honing in on is the first one here, to King Solomon. Maybe eventually I'll come across something, or maybe one of you guys will come across something that shows us that, this can also be tied back to this guy in Ezra. So here's the reference to King Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 10. It says, now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. Besides that which came from the explorers and from the business of the merchants and from all the kings of the West and the governors of the land. 2 Chronicles chapter 9 says pretty much the same thing. That the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents. And so when we see something like that, is like, we ask, is that a coincidence that it's 666 and that the Antichrist number is 666? Is that a coincidence? Are those numbers, it's possible, or is John, who knew his Old Testament, is he trying to point us in a certain direction? Is he trying to telegraph something to us? And that's a question I had last year, and I was open to it being a coincidence, but I was also open to it, the number of the beast somehow referencing Solomon. And so as I read my Bible last summer, I just kept coming across different things that, pointed to the character of who Solomon was. And so I kind of want to run through the life of King Solomon, particularly after, he met the Queen of Sheba. It says that when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of Yahweh, she came to test him with hard questions. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind in terms of these riddles or these questions that she had for him. And Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. And the queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he built, the food at his table, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants, their clothing, his cupbearers, and his burnt offerings that he offered to the house of the Lord. There was no more breath in her. And then later on in chapter 10, that's when it talks about, the weight of gold that came to Solomon. I'm not going to read the whole thing. We'll just kind of skim through this, but says that he received 666 talents of gold. And then it says down in verse 21 towards the bottom there, it says all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None were of silver. Silver was not considered as anything in the days of Solomon. For the king had a fleet of ships of Tarshish at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the fleet of the ships of Tarshish would come bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. And the reason why I highlighted or pointed out here, the house of the forest of Lebanon, the ships of Tarshish is, and I didn't put this specifically in this study, but, Lebanon, Bashan, Tarshish are all targets of God on the day of the Lord. When a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament talk about the coming day of the Lord, or that the Lord has a day, the enemies that he's zeroing in on, he talks about them being from Lebanon. The cedars of Lebanon are his target. The oaks of Bashan are his targets. The ships of Tarshish are his targets. And so it's interesting that part of Solomon's fame and the luxurious life that he lived was, because he purchased wood from Lebanon. That's how he built the temple. The ships of Tarshish, the oaks of Bashan. And Bashan is, I think we've talked about this before, that Bashan, to an ancient Israelite, when they heard the term Bashan or the region of Bashan, they connected it to the supernatural powers of darkness, because that's where Mount Hermon was near Bashan. And if we keep going in 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 26 here, it says that, and Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. And then it lists how many he had. He had 1,400 chariots, 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. So whoever wrote First Kings is saying, they're pointing this out to us, that he had chariots and horsemen, and then he numbers them specifically. Question is why? Why does he go into that much detail? And then we see in chapter 11, it says King Solomon loved many foreign women from all of these different, countries, nations. And it lists them, the daughter of Pharaoh, the Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women from the nations concerning which Yahweh had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. And Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. And then in verse 4 it says, for when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart to other gods. It wasn't when he was young. It wasn't when he was young and then later on in his old age, he came to his senses. The Bible never says that. It actually says when he was old, they turned his heart away. And then it says, verse 6, Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And he did for all his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifices to their gods. So not only did he turn away from Yahweh, but he actually turned and followed these other gods. And he built altars for them. And it goes on to list all of the ones that he did. And so if we read through First Kings 10 and 11, the writer specifically mentions certain things, mentions all the gold that he had, the gold that he received every year. It mentions the horses that he acquired and his chariots. And then it talks about the women that he married and the gods that he worshiped. And if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, God tells Israel, this is Moses talking to Israel before they enter the promised land. And he basically tells them, you're going to go into the promised land. You're going to set yourself up as a nation. Eventually, you guys are going to want a king. Like Moses knows it. But Moses also knows, because if you read in Deuteronomy, he knows that Israel is going to fail. Because they failed with him when they were in the wilderness. And he knows that it's only a matter of time before they fail. He says, before long, you guys are going to ask for a king. And he says here in verse 14, when you come to the land that Yahweh your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom Yahweh your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only, and then it lists some stipulations, for the requirements. One, he has to be from Israel. And then he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. And I'm wondering if that might have been why the writer of First Kings says that he made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, and maybe it had to do with the horses. Maybe he did it so he could get horses. Because Yahweh said to you, you shall never return that way again, talking about Egypt. And he says, you shall not acquire many wives, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So we had these stipulations, yeah, he did come from Israel. Now that I think, I'll skip that one. So he broke the 3 commands: not to acquire many horses, not to marry a whole bunch of women, and not to acquire silver and gold. And Solomon broke all 3 of those. He acquired many horses. He married 700 plus 300 concubines. And he acquired excessive amounts of gold, 666 talents yearly. And he did all of this while being the wisest man who ever lived. So I don't think he could claim ignorance. I don't think Solomon did all of this out of ignorance. He knew what he was doing. You know, God granted him wisdom. So yeah, Solomon, he didn't turn away from God out of ignorance. He was smart. And so what we get is really a tale of two Solomons. And you know, we see in chapter 3 that it says that Solomon, he loved God. But later on, we see that he also loved many women, foreign women. In chapter 6, we see that he built the temple for Yahweh. It took him 7 years to build it. And then in chapter 7, it says he spent 13 years building his own palace. So he spent twice as long building his own house as he did for the house of God. So he did build the temple, but he also built altars to other gods as well. And then we see that God gave him exceedingly great wisdom, but yet he still went astray and followed other gods. Let me see. I think I'll stop here. Let me see. Yeah, I think I'll stop here, and then we'll pick it up with this study or this paper that was written it came out like a year ago now, but there were a couple of old or scholars, they're New Testament scholars though, and they tied the number 666 back to Solomon, which was interesting. And so I think the last study I did on Solomon, because I was trying to go through so much stuff, we only touched on like 1 or 2 points in this article. And so next week I want to go through it more thoroughly. But just to give you the ending, their conclusion is they say it would seem that wisdom and discernment about Solomon indicates that he too has something to contribute to the mysterious number of Revelation 13. And so that's where we'll pick it up next week, talking about this article.